Welcome to Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young.
Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young that you see right there. I'm your host, Mike Leon. Clarke is a seasoned family law attorney with decades of experience handling high-conflict custody disputes. And in today's episode, Clarke will explain why divorces that involve borderline personality disorder, they aren't just difficult, but they also expose the failures of a family court system that was never designed to handle them. So, Clarke, so good to see you again. I want to ask you just at a high level here because we talked about it in the last episode about borderline personality disorder. But let's get into how a BPD divorce is different compared to other divorces that you've potentially have handled, such as these typical high conflict divorces.
All right. So the way I approach this is that there are many, many family lawyers out there who are handling caseloads of 20, 30, 40 cases at a time. They probably in that mix have one or more borderline divorces, but they don't know that that's what's going on. And they have a one-size-fits-all approach to these cases. I call these non-borderline cases either garden variety divorces, by which I mean they involve people who are divorcing who are pretty much psychologically speaking normal range individuals who've just come to a point in their lives where they want to separate, go separate ways, and follow separate dreams. Those are, as I say, garden variety. There's also another class I would say of these divorces where there may be some psychological issues. Probably almost everybody has, if they took the battery of psychological tests, they would have different scales that were elevated that would be someone not like someone who might possibly suffer from something, right? And by the way, that's almost a quote from a child custody evaluator whose report I read years ago. I think you could have gotten, in that case, a better evaluation from a fortune teller at a county fair. But a lot of these evaluators just will not diagnose. They're afraid to diagnose, even when they're ordered to do so by a court. So in the second category of cases, you have people that do have some elevated or perhaps even diagnostic issues, but they're not the kinds of issues where their relationships are based upon control, manipulation, subjugation to their will, deceit, and just humiliation, destruction, basically. So when you have those people whose modus operandi is to destroy and subjugate, you're going to end up with a person who is able, almost by their own nature, by the way they've been grown up and the way they've been raised, to manipulate the court system, control the court system, deceive the court, and deceive everybody. So these cases cannot, by their nature, be handled as a garden variety case or even as a case where there are some psychological issues where someone may have an addictive personality disorder, or they may be somewhat histrionic, or they may be codependent a bit. We're not talking about that level of problem. We're talking about someone who really, as I've said before, they're really vampires. They're humanoids, but there's nothing about how they conduct themselves in relationships that are human. And I want to make a distinction here. You have the borderlines and the vampires, if you will, who are relating to everybody from this power, control, manipulation, and deceit and subjugation perspective. Well, how do normal people relate to each other? And what amazes me is that no one talks about what I'm about to say. Children who get this in school, you don't get this in religious training anymore. You don't get it at home very much. Where are people getting this? If you asked 100 people on the street, why are virtues called virtues? They couldn't even answer the question. They just don't know. And the reason they're called virtues is because virtues are what make relationships, healthy relationships, work. They're the oil that keeps the relationship engine running. So if you sat down and in 60 seconds wrote every virtue you could think of, and then sat down and wrote a list of all of negative qualities you could think of, most people would struggle in 60 seconds to come up with nearly as many things on their list as being qualitative virtues and aspects and qualities and traits as they would for negative aspects, emotions, and traits. So that kind of tell you, as a society, we're focused and have been probably since after World War II on pathology and negative behavior patterns. We don't really study happiness and what makes relationships work. Although there is a growing trend in the psychological community there, it's a minority in that field. So here you are in a court system where you're faced with dealing with someone who is from birth on is being has developed skills for manipulating other people. And I'm going to digress a second and say that the genesis of borderline personality disorder is usually between birth and age 5, although it gets layered on more and more and more the older the child gets. But in that period, the typical stereotypical parent is a mother who alternately rejects and then rescues, rejects and rescues the child. This is usually a mother who has very poor parenting skills, and for example, will think that if they ignore the child's crying, they're teaching the child not to cry, and then they go in after the child gives up trying to communicate, and then they put the child on the mother's breast, and suddenly the child is comforted and the mother feels like a hero, and they think they're actually helping the child learn. But that's not what is happening. The child's needs are being neglected because the child is trying to communicating, I have a wet diaper, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm fussy, I'm sick, I'm something. But those signs are not being recognized. So what does the child naturally do? What would any child do? They would try to figure out how to manipulate the mother into meeting their needs. And that's the template that gets laid in early on. So when you think about it, when that imprint goes in, that's hardwired. That's why there's no therapy that works for borderlines. That's why they can't be cured. That's why there's minimal help with maybe helping them recognize what triggers them. But other than that, you really can't help a borderline. So with that pathetic prognosis, you're going into a court system where the judge is trying to decide who is going to get custody. And in many states like California, you have a system where the presumption under the statute is shared joint physical legal custody, unless you can show good cause why the court should move away from that presumption. And that's why these cases are so highly conflicted. So again, back to the question, why are these cases not garden variety? And why do they cost probably in the range of $12,000 to $15,000 a month for a year and a half in order to litigate? It's because the borderlines are so adept at doing what they do when they manipulate people, including the court system, including their attorneys.
Yeah.
I would say the worst case I've ever had was a case, actually I've had two, where I'm sure that both the other party and their attorney were both borderlines. And if you think dealing with one borderline is hard, try and deal with two.
All right.
So that is a introduction to answer your question as to what makes these borderline divorces so impossible. I mean, they're very, very difficult to litigate because the courts refuse to address the psychological problem that is underlying and driving the conflict. And until they do, the conflict won't go away, but the courts won't ever go there and do that unless you force them. And
Right.
that's what this is all about.
You touched on the children part of this, and obviously, when we talk about custody, we talk about children, right? So, how do these cases, in your estimation, your years of experience of handling this, how do these cases affect the kids out there?
Okay, so this is a great question. We could spend an entire hour just on this. The short version is that, um, as I mentioned before, the borderline imprint is imprinted between birth and, say, age 4 or 5, and then it's just reinforced after that. The literature is pretty clear that when you have say, a borderline mother and a same-sex child, i.e., a daughter, the borderline imprint is imprinted on that same-sex child. If you have, for example, a borderline mother and an opposite sex child, in this case a son, that opposite sex child will be imprinted with anxiety disorders. So they'll be prone to depression. They become usually moderately severe, severely ADHD, and they have a lot of anxiety issues on that side. There are a lot of reasons for that, but that's what the studies have shown. Also, about 80% of all borderlines are females, and about 20% are males. The mirror image of borderlines in males are narcissists. They're really like Siamese twins. And um, in that case, the narcissists, about 75% or 70% of all narcissists are men, and about 25-30% are women. So uh, the other commonality is that the core wounds, although the causes of the core wounds are the same, for some reason, they don't know why, uh, boys and girls internalize and then manifest and process the same sorts of trauma differently. And in a word, I'm oversimplifying here, but with borderlines, they internalize it as a fear of abandonment. They're afraid you're going to leave them. So their whole game of subjugation is going to be to try and keep you in their sphere of influence because they don't want you to leave. Whereas with a narcissist, it's a fear of rejection, that you're going to find them somehow inadequate, not good enough or something. And that fear manifests as narcissism. So beyond that, um, you can see one other almost stereotypical distinction between narcissists and borderlines is going to be that the narcissist, when they look in the mirror, they see this wonderful, exaggerated, idealistic self, and they're perfect. Well, the perfection in a borderline actually is quite different. When they look in the mirror, it's like the vampire again. They don't have an identity. They have no internal sense of who they really are. Their identity is gained only by who's on the outside and who is validating them and telling them they're beautiful, intelligent, wonderful, funny, or whatever they're telling them. And that is what creates an identity for the borderline, which is a false identity. But they both, narcissists and borderlines, have this false sense that they're perfect inside because the imprint went in so early and so deep and so permanently that they think the whole world is made up of people just like them. And they're perfect. There's nothing wrong with them. And they treat everybody as though they're just like them. And it all becomes um, a host uh, predator relationship. It's a predatory parasite feeding on somebody. But at the same time, whenever you question their perfection, they think that you're victimizing them, even though they are what I call the predatory victims. They're the predators playing to be victims. So to go back to your question, with all this as a background, uh, the imprint goes in with children so that it's inevitable that by age 4 or 5, they're going to have internalized and been imprinted with this, which is why it's so incredibly important that judges act when they're in their infancy and they have to figure out what's going on um, through the behavior of the borderline adult. When children end up being around 13, 14, 15, and the borderline persona begins to emerge and the narcissistic tendencies begin to emerge, then it's really easy to look and say, oh, look, this child is evidencing pathological behavior. And everybody knows that you don't get pathological behavior if the parenting is normal range parenting. You only get pathological symptoms when there's a pathogen in one or both of the parents. So to answer your question, you're going to get children that are going to be heavily traumatized, feel very empty in the case of the borderline child, and they're going to have difficulty and instability with their interpersonal relationships. They are going to, at a younger age, probably evidence some real signs of suicidal ideation. They are going to become defiant and difficult and develop other subsidiary issues, if you will, because many times there will be a comorbidity depending upon how severe the borderline diagnosis is. You'll also see comorbidities like misdiagnoses for like codependency or histrionic or addictive personality disorder, things like that. But those are the kinds of things that are going to happen with a child. And just to wind this part up a little bit, to answer your question, the real trick for me is to try and get somebody, a psychologist, to evaluate the pathogenic parent and diagnose them, and then try to get in and get the court to understand that this is a problem that's not going to go away. And in reality, the studies have shown that child psychological abuse, you really have to hear this, child psychological abuse and child neglect are actually equal to or worse than physical violence to a child. Because a child will instinctively know that physical violence is wrong, that their parents shouldn't be beating them, but the child will not necessarily understand the psychological abuse or the child neglect that's happening. And both of those categories under the DSM-5 are discussed, and you can see a direct relationship between the diagnostic criteria of BPD and the symptoms in child neglect and child psychological abuse cases.
Yeah.
And most psychologists don't see that. They don't even know that. They don't even discuss it in their reports. It's a shame. I mean, it's scandalous. But these are the things that people have to somehow bring to the court's attention in order to demonstrate to the court that the child is at risk and that irreversible damage is being done to the child from day one. Yeah. I hope I've answered your question a little bit.
No, you haven't. You funneled into the follow-up perfectly because we danced around a little bit of the court system, lawyers' understanding of this, subject matter experts that are called to testify about this, the judges as well. So what do these cases tell us about the court system overall? Is it broken in terms of understanding these types of divorces that involve BPD?
The short answer is it's totally broken. I think that the family court system doesn't do exit polls for a reason. They know that there are not going to be any satisfied customers. And they'll rationalize that by saying, well, everybody wants everything and they, I divide things and I do what I think is justice. And no, that's not what people with borderline cases are talking about. That's your normal garden variety case. Maybe you can rationalize it that way, Your Honor, but that's not what's happening with borderline cases. It's just not in the ballpark. In borderline cases, I don't think it's unfair to say that the court system is destroying America one family at a time because they will not step up. They will not look at these cases in the way, in the detail, and the sophistication that's required. And they will not identify someone as a pathogen. And there are many reasons for this, and we can get into if you want to get into more detail. But the short answer is you ask anybody who's been through a borderline divorce, and they will tell you 999 times out of 1,000 that the judge was part of the problem, if not the biggest problem.
Wow. Well, Clarke, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for the insights and time that you've given us today on this subject matter. We truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Mike. See you soon.
See you soon. And thank you to everybody out there for listening to another episode of Vampire Divorce. You want to reach out to Clarke, visit clarkeyoung.com. Do me a favor, like, subscribe to get notifications of when new episodes of this show are posted. And do me a favor as well, forward this to somebody that you know needs to listen to this. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.